Hello again and welcome to the Solid Signal podcast for the week of November 11th, 2013. I'm recording this on November 11th, and so it's Veterans Day, and even though you might be listening to this later, still you might want to take a minute and thank a veteran that you know just for keeping things safe here in our country for 240-something, I'm not very good at math, years. At any rate, let's get to the podcast this week because even though everything has to do with veterans and they have made our world safer, this particular podcast is more about Microsoft. Microsoft may have a bunch of veterans in it, but that's not really the focus of things here today. Is it just me, or does it seem like Microsoft is everywhere all of a sudden? If they're paying good money for PR, let me tell you, it's working. Their search for a new CEO is being conducted very publicly, and that's good for them because every time their name comes up in the news, and it's not a negative report, for example, Windows 8 really stinks, then it's good for them. I've also noticed that Microsoft is spreading their money around in promotional spending in television shows just like Apple has been doing for many years. If you ever wondered why it seemed like all of the people on your favorite television shows used Apple computers, well, now you know why. Because Apple was paying them to do it. Microsoft started doing the same thing. Last year, they teamed with the people at Parks and Recreation, who very conspicuously use Windows 8, and this year they're spreading it around quite a bit more. CBS's The Millers just had an episode where the mother had to try to use Bing for the first time. Now, come on, let's be honest. Would she have really chosen Bing for her first search engine? But it's an example of how Microsoft is spending its money, and it's certainly an example of how it's working. Microsoft cannot afford another high-profile goof like what happened in most of 2013. Windows 8 and the Surface tablet were an unmitigated disaster for the company, causing huge charge-offs and immense bad press. They need something a lot better than that, and they need it fast. They've gotten that message, and let's be honest, Windows 8.1 is a lot better. It's not like they made huge changes, but they just made enough changes so that if you want to ignore that massive start screen mess and the Windows Store with practically no apps in it, you can. And that's important. That little thing, that little bit, really makes a difference. The Surface 2 tablet hasn't exactly been well reviewed, but it's not being thoroughly trashed like the original Surface tablet. They've made meaningful improvements. The quality of the screen is better, even though battery life is still not terribly good. It's still a very bad compromise between a tablet and a laptop, but at least it's a more usable one. Now, honestly, it's been decades since Microsoft won any sort of acclaim for its Office software, which is the bane of many Office workers, and folks just desperately try to find any way to avoid using it. That includes, honestly, lesser alternatives from places like Apple and Google. And Office is a better product. The problem is it's also a much more expensive one, and now that they've moved to a subscription model, it's even worse. Here, Microsoft seems to be moving toward controlling the conversation using studied silence. They're focusing on their wins, like for example Windows 8.1, instead of focusing on Office, which maybe they realized is just not going to energize people anymore. I think we've moved past the point where word processing and spreadsheets are going to impress us. Come on, folks, it's not 1986. Now, by way of disclaimer, I'll tell you that I am not up for the job at Microsoft. I'm not ever going to be considered for a senior management position at Microsoft, most likely. I did apply to them about 20 years ago for a much lesser position and got turned down for that. So I can sit here and contemplate what I think they should do without any fear of media scrutiny. I think that Microsoft should spin its consumer products off from its business products. I know, they just merged with Nokia, and so it seems a little bit strange to do a spin-off right away, but if you think about it, Microsoft's consumer products like Xbox and its Windows Phone operating system, that sort of thing, have never really been in step with its business products like Windows Server, for example. I know that Microsoft likes to talk about a one Windows philosophy, but you know what? That's falling flat. One Windows doesn't work. One Windows doesn't make any sense because, you have a different need for something on a tiny little screen than you do on a gigantic screen. So, enough with the one Windows. we can live without it. If you want to make Xbox look like Windows Phone and have some way for the interface on the consumer version of Windows to look something like that, fine, I'm okay with it. But you know what? People, the very same people who will use Windows at home and want all sorts of flashy googas and doodads and whatever, just want to get work done at work without a whole lot of distraction. That's why a lot of workplaces still use Windows XP, because people don't care about all the fancy stuff. They just want to get in and out of work with as little trouble as possible. So create Windows for Business. Do that. Servers, desktop operating systems, make sure everything's still compatible, but the most important thing is that it's easy to use for business. I'm not saying that you should have two different operating systems and that should be completely fragmented between home and business. Exactly the opposite. I'm just saying make sure that business users can use Windows for business and that it makes sense for them, and that home users can use it that way too if they want to, because really nobody's terribly excited about Microsoft operating systems on the desktop anyway. Focus on things like Xbox One and Windows Phone and all the exciting stuff, and let business services be business services. When IBM split off its PC manufacturing business and gave it to Lenovo, who was doing most of the PC manufacturing anyway, people thought it wasn't going to work. But the truth is that IBM is stronger than it ever was because they didn't want or need consumer PCs. They wanted business. Let Microsoft do that. Maybe they'll be good at it. After all, I'll say this and then I'll wrap up this podcast because it's gotten way too long. We all need a strong Microsoft. We do need our PCs on occasion, especially at work. So it doesn't make sense to wish for Microsoft to completely fail. We just want them to wise up a little bit. In the meantime, if you have a topic for another podcast, suggest it at the Solid Signal blog, blog.solidsignal.com. I look forward to hearing from you next week. And until then, have a great one.